I'm Allie Mooney. I work at Google, where I do trends and insights. I'm pretty new to Google, so if you ask me exactly what that means, I won't be able to give you a very good answer yet, but I'm basically working on thought leadership initiatives, helping Google communicate its quiet rocket science to the rest of the world, but also helping them stay aware of what's going on in the marketplace, the trends, et cetera. Before that, I used to work at a mobile agency, so I have a background in emerging trends in mobile.
Hi everyone, I'm Aisha Kana. I am founder and principal of the Hybrid Reality Institute that's based in New York. And we study the social, political, and economic implications of emerging technologies, focusing particularly on the hybrid age, which I'll talk about a little later. My background is in technology and innovation. I've been consulting for over 10 years in a variety of industries in New York.
Hi, my name is Greg Lindsay. I'm a contributing writer to Fast Company and a visiting scholar at NYU. I just published a book about globalization and air travel called Aerotropolis. The focus of most of my work these days is particularly on cities and the union of sort of cities, transportation, technology, looking at mobility and looking also at smart cities and the notion of cities as sort of the next computing platform, which we'll hear about later this afternoon as well.
Great. And I'm Catherine Moriwaki. I'm an assistant professor at Parsons School of Design and the School of Art, Media, and Technology. I teach primarily in the MFA Design Technology program, where we essentially look at the broad range of interaction design practice with a special emphasis on entertainment, aesthetics, expression, and communication. So we tend to make like games, a lot of great websites, some interactive art installations, and quite a bit of really fun, cool, hackery kind of stuff.
Fantastic. All right, guys. So I think the way that I'd like to kick this off a little bit here, and Aisha, maybe you can sort of take the microphone here to begin with. But I'm really interested in exploring this idea of people's relationship to technology now and where we're at, and looking at where that's perhaps heading. And as you mentioned, this idea of the hybrid age, maybe you can set the stage with that a little bit.
Okay, so the topic of this panel is what's next. But I don't think we can understand our relationship with technology or what's coming next without taking a big step back. So I'm going to go back about 250,000 years when Homo sapiens first emerged, and I'm going to talk about 4 technological revolutions that humanity has experienced. The first being the Stone Age, where we use stone tools to hunt and gather and dominate other species. Then 10,000 years ago, we became farmers. We settled down in communities. In fact, we formed cities 5,000 years ago, and we became specialized in different fields. Then, around the 15th century, the speed of innovation really picked up, and we had a lot of breakthroughs in the sciences, astronomy, biology, physics. And around the 18th century, after the Renaissance, it really began to tip over and reach the masses, and that's when we had the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, again, dramatically changed the way we live our lives. We began to have mass production with technologies like the steam engine and steam power, and we began to also see a great rise in market economies. In the late 1970s, we entered what is commonly known as the information age. So the information age is when devices and computers can very easily enable humans to create and exchange information. So the birth of the personal computer, the rise of globalization or the intensification of globalization after the birth of the World Wide Web, the idea of the knowledge worker, again, fundamentally changed what we consider what the consumer wants or what labor markets really want and are marketable. And so most of us think that we are still in this information age. And I think it's quite different. I think we're transitioning to a new era that heralds a very different relationship between technology and humanity. And this is the hybrid age. And I define the hybrid age by 3 characteristics. First, technology proliferation. So we think we're surrounded by technology because we have our smartphones and our laptops, and we have our TVs and our washing machines, but technology is going to explode all around us. So literally, we say we live in public, we will live in technology, because little sensors and machines of all sizes and shapes will be embedded in everyday objects around us, including in our own bodies. Second, technology intelligence. So in the information age, technology devices are essentially dumb repositories of information for the most part. And they require humans to understand them and to act upon them. And if there is some intelligence, it's very basic, as we see in the factories or even in a Google search. That's going to change fundamentally. As machines become more intelligent, they will be able to work autonomously and also be able to respond to our needs in much more intelligent ways. Now, an interesting aspect of intelligence is that when machines become intelligent, they become social, right? So then we'll see a lot of interesting social relationships with these machines also arise. And then the third thing is that the very nature of technology, because of the inclusion of emerging markets and millions of people who are now going to be playing with this, will see constant innovation and disruption. So these three characteristics really change the landscape that we're looking at. And for the next, I would say, at least 3 or 4 decades, we're going to be in the hybrid age. And it's a very good background to talk about what's coming up next.
Excellent. Allison, I'm wondering, given the work that you're doing and some of the ideas that you're talking about, obviously with the proliferation of information that's sort of taking off and all of this data is coming at us, whether through content and I suppose through data that we're creating by sort of these activities that we're doing. If you could talk a little bit about some of this idea of curation that you're seeing and how that's evolving. Is this going to be, to Aisha's point, is this going to be solely based on sort of computer algorithms, or is the human sort of still going to play a role in that equation?
Sure. Well, right now I think we're seeing both, right? You're seeing automated curation through things like Hunch, for example, that you input, you answer some questions, and it will learn your tastes eventually. And also, another example is Flavor Pill. They just launched a new newsletter that will customize itself based on your reading habits and your reading patterns. So if you tend to read certain stories and stay longer reading certain stories, they'll feed up more stories like that, right? But a lot of these automated platforms are also based on, have a human back end, right? So things like Paperly, for example, you might see people tweeting out their daily buzz, and that will aggregate people that you're already following. So you follow the curators, the human curators, and then it will automatically compile sort of the best of those, right? So I don't think the human will be lost in this in any time in the near future. I think, as with the proliferation of content, that is the key role. I think curation is going to be prized a lot more over creation in the future. So people, you're seeing them now, these amateur curators on Twitter, and getting as much following as like a CNN, and CNN relying on these people for an iReport, for example. So I think it'll be a mix. It'll be a hybrid for that. And not to get off topic, but I just love the point you made earlier about the social relationship we'll have with our technologies, and I just wanted to bring up a study that I just love the study. So Roomba vacuums, right? So people have these Roomba vacuums, and people started making costumes for them. And I forget the name of these costumes, but you can go online and buy costumes for your Roomba. And there was a university down south did a study where they found that people became more attached to their Roombas when they had costumes and were more forgiving when they broke down, right? So I think, emotional design, designing our machines to be more human will definitely be a trend in the future.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think in that same study they talked about how people had an affection for the Roombas that also were a little bit imperfect in some way as well. So,
Right.
Catherine, maybe given the work that you're doing, you can sort of talk about that in terms of the work that your students are doing and some of the things that you're seeing in terms of how people are sort of hacking technology.
Sure. Well, I really appreciated Aisha's take on the hybrid age, because much of what she talked about is sort of, much of what she talked about is, much of that information is pretty much is the type of thinking, if you will, that I had already encountered, say, for example, in ubiquitous computing research. Right? And so I actually really appreciate this kind of recasting of some of that early computer science work, which has essentially laid the groundwork for much of the increased proliferation and expansion, if you will, of the relevance of computational technologies in our lives. I think that's absolutely super on track, and thank you for that. And when it comes to, I guess, sort of artistic and emotional interpretations of technology, I think that's precisely why we need to have artists and designers involved in the process of creating technology, and not just to skin the tech. Actually, there's been, over the course of many decades now, discussions about human-computer interaction and interaction design and the shortcomings of that practice, and how these much sort of fuzzier, trickier problems that deal with emotional communication, emotional attachment, self-expression, are things which are much harder to capture in a simple user study, and oftentimes are the domain of artists and designers. We understand engagement, we know how to entertain people, and these are the things that computer science has not yet really been able to touch and crack, because it's not a science, really.
Excellent. So to Greg, I want to bring you into the conversation here. I'm wondering, obviously, a lot of the work that you're doing is related to cities and how technology is impacting the way that not only people are sort of engaging with their cities, but potentially how that is going to influence the way that cities are built in the future. And I thought there was something interesting that you mentioned, the fact that even though people are connecting more over social media nowadays, that it still hasn't impacted travel at all. Maybe you can start with that, and we can sort of move on from there.
Sure. I mean, one of the things I touch upon in my book is the notion of, for 15 years since George Gilder and Negroponte, basically talked that rising information technology would eliminate the need for physical distance, the death of distance, the reduction in travel. Some people even predicted the death of cities, that basically we'd all be able to scatter into the countryside with a broadband connection, and that's all we'd ever need. And of course, those predictions were exactly the opposite. We've seen increased urbanization, we've seen increased travel, and one of the laws I actually lay out in my book is the notion that basically for every communication you have that's virtual, there is a percentage chance that you will meet that person face to face. It will lead you into contact. And the example I have of this out of my own life is, I was searching for my book title on Twitter and found an Intel futurist who was reading my book on the Mumbai to Stockholm flight and loved it, and so I tweeted at him, and then he tweeted back, and then we went to email, and then we went to phone to talk, and now I'm going to go out to Portland to visit him. And so, therefore, this is created after multiple messages, an information technology that made it possible, me actually traveling more. So we're seeing a world, basically, the larger premise is we're seeing a world that's more connected, both physically and virtually, and that the telepresence or whatever else we develop won't eliminate that need. But in the sense of cities, it's really interesting. Cities are going through a white-hot moment right now. There seems to be a ton of interest in it academically and otherwise, and I think for a couple of reasons. One is the notion that Jane Jacobs came up with, 40 years ago, that cities are where innovation happens, where new work is added to old work, and where ideas come from. And Stephen Johnson just published a book, Where Good Ideas Come From. Edward Glaser just published Triumph of the City. There's this recognition that cities, and dense cities in particular, are where innovation happens and where we basically spawn ideas faster than anyone. So what's interesting is that from that, you're seeing a lot of interest by governments and a lot of other organizations to create cities. Because the other side of that equation is that, there's a report by the Lincoln Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, land policy. The urban footprint of the Earth is going to double in 19 years. We're going to build more. We're going to build everything we have now. And to see that in action, The Economist just put out a report yesterday on China building cities. The city of Chongqing is going to build more housing stock in the next 10 years than all of Poland has today. And Chengdu is going to build more than Switzerland. So statistics like this. So it's really interesting. So to me, this spawns a couple things. You see non-traditional actors who are trying to create cities from scratch, whether they're economists like Paul Romer, who's trying to create new Hong Kongs for developing countries, or you see, the petrostates of the Middle East are basically, forging ahead with building massive airlines to connect the world through there. Or you see technology companies are investing in it. Because one of the things that's come up with the discussions of, of the hybrid age and Ubicomp is the notion that, for decades, we've been trying to build ubiquitous computing, and it's failed at every step. The technology's never been there. More to the point, there was no killer app. Consumers rejected it. No one needed an internet-enabled toaster. There was simply no point. But what's interesting is that the growth of cities, the challenge of urbanization, and particularly climate change in cities, because 50% of humanity lives in a city and it's 72% of electricity usage, et cetera, is that it's allowed companies like IBM and Cisco to really come out and say, the reason this time is sustainability. We need to imbue intelligence into our systems because we need to make them more efficient and therefore more sustainable, which is driving the investment in the hardware required to develop Ubicom. And so this is why I think the next platform, before we get to wearable computing, before we get into the cyborg forms that have been discussed in sci-fi forever, is the city is going to be the next platform. And you're going to hear more about that from New York later this afternoon. But it's really interesting is, that's where sort of, to me, augmented reality is going, located-based media is going, is people are trying to build urban operating systems that can integrate all these different things together. And that, that creates opportunities if it's open source, where citizens can really act on that, or it creates dangers where you basically, who owns your data cloud? Who owns the aggregated data, which is going to be our sort of next great resource, the ability to really sort of make cities and life more efficient by sort of aggregating data and making new use of it. So that to me is the really interesting thing about where sort of the smart cities is going and what's going to be the precursor to some of the longer term trends.
Awesome. I wonder if maybe to sort of pick up on one of the threads there. Obviously, with all the activity that people are doing, and like you said, this idea of what's happening to my data. This issue of privacy is something that's really important, and oftentimes I think Europe is ahead of the United States in terms of sort of dealing with this issue in a lot of ways. And I think as that understanding is happening, I'm curious where it seems like there's this tension right now between people wanting to share everything on social media on some level, but then also wanting to pull that back and protect. And I wonder if maybe, Aisha, you can start talking about that, and then we can build from there.
Okay, yeah, so I think that one of the fundamental tensions in this hybrid age is going to be this, I think it's a false choice that will be given again and again by corporations and governments that will say, for convenience and security, you have to give up your privacy and your freedom, to have a private life. And in fact, what will most likely happen is that that privacy will become something that we pay for. And so what I think we tend to focus on right now is that people are life blogging. They're tweeting and they're putting up Facebook statuses and they're blogging. And we think, wow, this is a real problem. People are just sharing too much information. But I think the bigger problem is that we'll be surrounded by technologies that actually will just, without our knowledge, be taking this information all the time. And we tend to do that all the time, right? We download new softwares on our phone, and we just say, I agree, I can't be bothered to read all that fine print. And it's very problematic. And so Adam Greenfield, who is a great voice in urban software and the need for us to be careful, talks about these cameras that were set up in a town in London. And essentially, he said that when the camera was set up, and there were cameras all over, London is known for having one of the most largest number of security cameras, CCTV everywhere, that there was a referendum that took place. And they asked them, is it all right that these cameras are there? And they explained to them what the camera would be doing, and they said, fine. And then 2 years later, they changed the software in the cameras. So now the cameras could do much more than just track you. They had facial recognition in them and some other very sketchy capabilities. But they never took the referendum. So as we see versions of software changing again and again in things that we carry in our houses or in our homes, in our hands, in our mobiles, this is extremely dangerous. And I basically think this is a new social contract that we are signing in a completely uninformed way. And it's one of the things that we do at our institute. One of our goals is to force a human-centered design, human-centered value system whenever these new technologies are rolled out, so that we can make informed choices. And I suspect we won't make the right choices. I think we will give up privacy for security and convenience, but at least we should be aware of it.
Catherine, I'm wondering, based on sort of some of Aisha's points, with the work that you're doing, obviously, open source is one of those, conversations that it gets at this idea of, opening up that technology and letting people take control over some of the activities that they're doing. Maybe you can talk about some of the work that you're doing and how that's sort of evolving and allowing sort of maybe less sort of sophisticated technologists sort of take part in this.
Yeah, I mean, that interesting of less sophisticated technologists. To me, it's in some ways an attempt at some form of digital literacy that actually moves beyond just understanding how to use a computer. And I mean literacy as in understanding what the computer does and the many forms that it presents itself as. So what you're referring to is basically the Scrapyard Challenge that I co-founded with Jonah Brooker-Cohen. And it's basically a workshop where we make electronic interactive objects out of found materials and junk. And we do it with a very limited time frame, 5 hours. And from city to city, what we essentially do is work with whatever infrastructure presents itself. So some cities have better junk than others and more available junk. So we'll go on a junk run, we'll acquire what we can, and then in the workshop space, all the participants, regardless of their level of experience with technology, can participate, because what we do is have a ready-made electronics board that takes very simple input and outputs musical data, right? And the participants then is tasked with creating a switch that goes into that. We provide the basic sort of framework for how to electrically construct a switch, and then they go from there using leftover VCRs, turntables, stuffed animals, beads, bits and pieces of conductive materials that might be left over as scrap. And from that, there's this realization that, oh, okay, that's essentially, fundamentally, when you're dealing with computers, we're talking about ones and zeros, switches. And it seems like something that's incredibly straightforward, but it's actually something that a large portion of the population simply does not understand. And so in that way, to make these informed decisions that Aisha's talking about, of really understanding how the social contract is changing, it can't happen unless people have some basic understanding of the operation of the systems that they're engaged with. And so far, most people just think, it happens. I don't know. Right? It's magic. Exactly. It's magic. So, we feel that, certainly it's not a large-scale effort. It's not, in some ways, it's more of a tactical effort, which artists have always traditionally kind of worked with, and designers too, these sort of tactics and small kind of local kinds of actions. But I think that these are really significant because these are the things, the person-to-person connection in the workshops, the actual connection of making the work, these are the things that actually transform individual perception. And when somebody leaves our workshops and their individual perception about the computer has changed, that's actually very significant right there, very important. And I'd say for the work that we do at Parsons, we have students who come from a broad range of backgrounds, some of whom have quite a great deal of technology skills, some of whom actually have very little. And it's interesting to see that it's not necessarily always the people who have the greatest tech skills who do the most interesting things. Again, it's those kind of fresh eyes, or if we will, sometimes sort of naive perceptions that can reinvent and actually look at technologies in a really refreshing sort of way. So, I don't want to discount that kind of perspective, but at the same time, it's really essential to sort of enable the broader population to have some kind of baseline understanding of what's going on around them. And again, intelligent decisions can't actually be made until that happens.
I'm curious, what changes, are you seeing any changes in the education system that will enable that?
Sure. I mean, absolutely, yeah. It's really exciting. One of our professors at Parsons, Katie Salen, she does Quest to Learn. And so, the schools essentially base their entire education based off of interactions with digital media. And at the same time, within Parsons, a lot of both students and faculty are really interested in developing tools that actually make it easier for artists and designers and sometimes regular everyday people to actually get involved in designing and making their own things. I think that's very significant. That's why I really love the DIY community. I mean, certainly there's to a certain extent, it's a lot of maybe what people may perceive as cute little projects, maybe sometimes even technically unsophisticated projects, but it's a real danger to kind of undermine the feeling of accomplishment that somebody gets when they understand how to wire up a switch, or the sense of satisfaction that provides, and the confidence that gives for that individual to continue actually investing in learning about technology, science, and electronics. So in our workshops, we had this really interesting experience. We did this workshop in Amsterdam. And we had a woman come who was getting her PhD actually in an HCI program, but her background was in jewelry design, traditional arts and crafts. And she had been working with these electronic engineers, electrical engineers, to develop these highly sophisticated, networked brooches, And it was amazing because the entire time she had been there, she actually hadn't built any electronics on her own. So, people talk a lot about multidisciplinary collaboration and cross-disciplinary collaboration and of working with artists and designers, but at the same time, those artists and designers should have some level of shared experience upon which to base their interactions. And if they don't actually have experience with each other's tools and technologies, things break down. So what was fascinating is by the end of our workshop, we had brought a bunch of conductive threads and conductive fabrics, and she was sitting there using her traditional knitting or embroidery techniques that she had learned in, university at I guess they call them, the diploma level or whatever in Europe. And she was like, this is absolutely fantastic. I understand this. She's like, for so long, I was so afraid. I was so afraid. And to actually work with this stuff. And it was amazing from that point onward. I mean, I absolutely feel that she felt confident to go ahead and maybe take an electronics class. Yeah. And it wasn't so scary, and sort of one little rung in the scaffold of how to sort of scale that learning curve, right, was placed. And I think that's significant.
I think, that's how innovation happens, right?
Yeah.
Like we want to talk a little bit about where does innovation come from? And you mentioned, Greg, Stephen Johnson's book, Where Do Good Ideas Come From, right? And he talks about the adjacent possible, which is when everything is has a certain configuration, and it's when just a slight change in that configuration will create something new, right? And it seems like you said when someone with fresh eyes can look at something that exists and create something new out of that, that's where innovation happens, not someone alone in a basement hacking away, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, there have been a number of different design theorists and designers who have been interrogating the, I guess, nature of designed object. Somebody like, say, for example, Anthony Dunn, who has been arguing from a product design perspective that product designers should actually actively be involved in the design of the operation, right, of the objects that they create. And I think, generally speaking, unfortunately, what ends up happening, it's changing, but from what I've heard is generally the case, is product designers design the skin, and they don't have as much of an input into actually what the operation, what goes inside. And I think things like that actually are changing, and they need to change more. Right? And I also think that it's really interesting when you have everyday individuals, the way in which they appropriate objects, misuse objects, abuse objects. I think these things are super interesting because they create little openings, little spaces, but that little space for operation can actually truly grow. So I'm sure a lot of people, most people have probably heard of the Arduino, right? A really wonderful open source DIY platform for doing electronics. And we were saying back in the green room before how it's such a fantastic platform because it's made learning electronics and building electronic interfaces for people so much easier. It's easier, that learning curve isn't as steep. And so people actually get less discouraged. And they're able to actually make something. That's the next step to actually really truly interrogating materials. And it's been a wonderful way for artists and designers to actually release their alternative visions for how electronic objects should operate and function, how they should be designed, who they should function for. I'll go back to Zachary Lieberman and Evan Roth, James Powderly of the Graffiti Research Lab. I think Zach Lieberman has actually spoken at PFK conferences before. Well, he and his collaborators basically have created the iWriter, right, which is a low-cost, under $50 eye tracking system that allows people to essentially write and draw on a computer through moving their eyes. That's it. But the key thing here is it's a bunch of artists who essentially got together and said, if you want to do eye tracking, it's ridiculously expensive. It's locked down by sort of corporations who have a proprietary interest in their technologies. And yet, think of all the really interesting things that could be done if you had a low-cost, inexpensive way to do this. And you know, to a large extent, they've succeeded doing it. They were working with a wonderful graffiti artist, actually, who had ALS, and they were able to actually allow him to do his graffiti again. Now, it's great, but then you think of, okay, that was a wonderful little artistic, you know, not little in any way, but I mean a wonderful artistic sort of application, but you can think of countless numbers of other, you know, more perhaps mundane or practical uses for something like that once it exists.
Well, I'd say that what's interesting to me about this is what it goes back to, I think of the bigger picture version of this, is that basically computing and computing models are going into life, which can be great and can also be terrible. Great in the sense, one of the other things we were discussing backstage is Connect, and whether Connect is going to be the sort of great physical gesture interface. The Rockefeller Foundation put out a report in December called The Planet of Civic Laboratories, basically looking at the ability of small-scale smart computing, smart city app projects worldwide, particularly in emerging nations, and sort of how to scale those up. And one of the interesting things they raise is that Connect, and its successor, creates gestural interfaces so that people who are not even literate, who may not even really have spoken language, even in some cases tribal, will be able to get government services, through the net, through using a gestural interface. So that's sort of the positive potential of that. If you make it open source, if you make it open systems and apply to that. The downside is, or the danger is that you end up with sort of closed systems, and you end up with proprietary. I mean, there's a startup in Portugal called Living Planet, where they're building their own city from scratch called Planet Valley, which is basically going to be a sort of think tank, development where they're going to build their own urban operating system. So basically, there's going to be an application stack for the city. And this is one of the things we've talked about in past, the dangers of this, where people don't really realize that if smart cities have application stack layers, changes in the bottom of the stack will lead to changes on top that we may not vote on, that we may not consent to. This sort of ties back to Aisha's point on that. What to me is more interesting is basically the real danger is that we're going to end up is basically imagine the browser wars, or imagine Android versus the iPhone operating system, where you're going to see that in everyday life, in applications in your city, where it's closed versus open, and market share battles applied to that. So that's I think, and then the ultimate danger, we're getting back to I guess the original privacy point is, Chongqing, which is building more housing than Poland, where they're urbanizing millions of farmers. Chongqing just put in an order for 500,000 new security cameras, all of which are going to have live video facial recognition, all of which are going to be built into an integrated system. So China is currently building the world's smartest surveillance society as we speak right now too. And that, that is a sort of long run of what's next with the smart city platform.
Aisha, I'm curious, you brought up this idea of invention versus innovation. And I wonder if you can talk about that sort of the slight difference in how that is influencing the way that advances are being made.
So at the Institute, we don't think that technology advances or a lot of the things that we're talking about here can really be thought of, or what's going to happen next in the world, in a very US-centric way. Most of the discussions that we have usually situate the user in a country in the West or the developed world, and usually in Silicon Valley. But really, to understand what's going to happen to technologies, we have to put them in a geopolitical context, see where it's happening, what the ripple effect is going to be on different regions and industries. And so let's step back and look at the map of the world and try to think of all the countries that are competing for economic and geopolitical clout. And then let's think of who is going to be controlling the 21st century's leading sectors. So let's talk about nanotech, robotics, biotech, clean tech. And so if you go and look at the rankings, the US is always in the top 3 across almost all of the sectors of the 21st century. And you may think, that's really reassuring, we're set. But that is very misleading. And the reason is, let's zoom in on the criteria for this ranking. It's really based on invention, number of patents filed, number of academic researchers, number of scientific journals that you've published in. Now, that means we're very good at lab research, or I like to say, we really like our mice. So when it comes to biotech, we're very good at testing on mice. But we never move beyond that. And innovation, if you look at Clay Christensen from HBS and Harvard Business School, I really like his definition. Innovation occurs when it adds value to the masses. So when an invention reaches the masses. If you look at the 20th century, the Brits were very, very annoyed that all the wonderful basic science research that was done in Britain actually was manufactured and scaled and really taken to market in the US. And now we in the US are feeling very similar anxiety about the research that we do over here and the fact that it is in East Asia, in China, in South Korea, and in Singapore that it's been aggressively commercialized. So I think we really need to think about this difference between invention and innovation and turn our focus back in this country towards commercialization.
And sorry,
Okay, go ahead,
there's a great article in Slate about this, and the author says that invention is for lawyers and innovation is for everyone else.
Nice.
And I really like that
I like
phrase.
that.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to leap in too. One of the things that I counter again and again talking to people is the notion that China doesn't innovate, or this whole notion that China is still copying us, et cetera. I mean, speaking of Harvard, they put out great research that that basically the net effect of our massive outsourcing of them of our technologies is that of all of the computing sector, for example, Apple is the only computing company in America that still even designs its own products. Everybody's outsourced the design to the Taiwanese and the Chinese, and as an effect of that, they've mastered the nuts and bolts innovation. I mean, what she's describing in the sense of learning to actually make with your hands. This is a form of learning and education that we have lost in the United States because we've gotten away from the metal. I mean, basically Korea and China is able to innovate faster in solar panel technology at this point because they're working with large quantities of industrial glass design and working on flat panels. And so basically, we have a threat in the United States, or the threat facing us is the fact that, well, I mean, it's twofold to me. A, we're losing a handle on the basic manufacturing, and two, something about patent law and intellectual property that is worrying to me is we've reached the point where in the United States is that you can have inventors and entrepreneurs on this side who can come up with an idea and then effectively outsource the mass manufacturing and engineering to China on the other side, which creates tons of jobs in China and accrues incredible wealth to the United States, but only to a handful of people. And I guess it's just a minor point on that. Ali mentioned the notion of the adjacent possible. That was coined by Stuart Kauffman, who was a scientist at Santa Fe Institute. He owns a patent on it. So we should be paying him royalties. Or actually, he lost control of his company, so the company owns his patent on it. And but that's where it's gotten to with that.
So we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to touch on this idea of sort of access to real-time data. I think the statistic was that in 2010, there was more sort of internet-connected devices than there were people actually logging onto the internet. So, Ali, I know that this was something that a point that you had raised, and I wonder if you can share some thoughts on what that's sort of enabling for businesses, people, et cetera.
Well, yeah, I think we touched on this a lot earlier, too, about the coming Internet of Things and how our societies would be all linked. I mean, we haven't touched too much on the fun consumer applications. We've been a little dystopic here. But, yeah, I mean, just thinking about what it can mean for us personally in the near future, I'm just looking at Fitbit, for example, which just opened their API. And that it will measure everything, like your sleep, your calories burned, your exercise, what you've eaten, and then that's sort of like the internet of you, right? And then that can be fed into any service that wants to tap into that API. I mean, that's really exciting. And more exciting than an internet-connected fridge or toaster, for example, right? I think these guys can talk more about the implications for cities in terms of what we're seeing with the smart meter and things. But I know in terms of data, I think you can get a lot of value from personal analytics and personal tracking, and it can help make our lives more optimized, but also more fun too. I mean, just checking in on Foursquare and seeing the analytics that it shows you, like, oh, I just saw this person, I haven't seen this person since last year or something. I think that's really interesting. But I think also the social comparison that can come once all that data is pooled together is really interesting. So, yeah, I'll toss it to someone else now.
Well, the idea of, you touched on that idea of sort of gamification in some ways, which I think is like really interesting once you have all this information about yourself, and then potentially the people around you sort of have that, then that's fundamental in sort of changing people's behaviors potentially. I wonder, just to sort of wrap things up here, maybe we can sort of go down the line and just, we can talk for 30 seconds about what's sort of exciting us sort of as we look to what is next. Catherine?
I'll start. Okay. What's exciting to me right now is basically the proliferation and access to simple components and electronics in order for people to build toolkits for each other, for their friends, for other people who would actually like to make technology, and technology projects, whether or not they're artistic or expressive, you have you. I think that that is one pathway that should absolutely be encouraged, and I would love to see proliferate actually for young people, for adults, and I'm just basically super excited. All the little DIY kits out there for people to be able to learn how to solder and build an electronic circuit, or say for example use a service like Patchabay, that was started by Usman Haq and Adam Somlai Fisher, who are both media artists actually, and for them to be able to make their sort of homemade kit connected to Patchabay and have it connected to something else. I really think the alternative way of working to find those little open spaces, to build those spaces, are one of the main ways in which we can individually and then ultimately perhaps collectively as a whole begin to develop alternative scenarios for a lot of these technologies. I mean, granted, many corporations have huge amounts of money invested in certain kinds of platforms and technology, and there's a vested interest, if you will, to lock down systems. But it's this small scale working actually that I think can serve as a little sort of counterpoint. Little tiny cracks, but you get enough cracks in there and something really big and important can happen. It can actually really destabilize a foundation.
I don't know, the thing that I find particularly intriguing is sort of the future of mobility, particularly seamless urban mobility and intercity mobility. I've written a lot about air travel, and what's interesting to me is talking to a lot of the airlines. They're basically all experimenting in social media, and they're all experimenting with using social media to make the travel experience better for travelers, but also seamlessness across platforms. So Lufthansa is experimenting with hybrid air, high-speed rail, and basically trying to get mobility there. And then the other thing I find really interesting is basically, mobility as a service. So basically, the next evolution of car sharing beyond Zipcar, where you're actually seeing twofold. You're seeing declining driver's license rates among young people. They'd rather have the seamless mobility of their mobile devices and social networks, and then let somebody else get them from point A to point B, which is mass transit in the short run. But I ultimately think, I'm going to steal Ali's answer here what the future is, which is robots, because I actually think that robotic cars and that point-to-point robotic mobility is very much the future of mobility in the sense of, and if you were at Expo 2010 in China, this is what both Cisco and General Motors showed as the future. So you can just see the fusion, which is, you are in a vehicle that is moving for you while you are telecommuting or you're doing telepresence with somebody else at the same time. And so I'm very, very intrigued at basically how are we moving physically and virtually at the same time, because the two stimulate each other. So I'm very curious to see how that relationship is going to evolve.
So we've all talked about technologies, but what really excites me about the future is people and what people can do with technology. And I think that we were a little dystopian here, but the scenario of Big Brother, I'm still very optimistic. I don't think it's going to happen. I think that what it requires for all of us is, now that we're connected through social media and other technologies, is to just flip a switch in our minds, that we're not just inhabitants of a city, we own it. This is our technology, this is still in our control. So all those feelings that are symptomatic of the information age, information overload, anxiety, feeling stressed, we really need to start taking ownership of that and start to feel more comfortable with the technologies, just like Catherine pointed out. So I think that we'll see a lot of interesting innovation and people coming together and being more activist in groups. And the people that really excite me are from emerging markets, because we have millions of people coming on to a lot of these technologies, and they're not very sophisticated technologies. They're mobile phones, for instance. 8 million new mobile user accounts are activated in India every month. And yes, most of them are listening to Bollywood music, but a lot of them are also thinking of new ways to do things. I mean, it was in Africa that we saw mobile banking before it ever reached the borders of the West. So I think we'll see a lot of interesting and fun things come out of that area.
Robots. No, I have a real answer. I'll just give it really quickly. I think there will be a lot of implications for healthcare. I think that's the most exciting for us as humans. Just looking at like Google flu trends or the internet-connected inhaler that will measure the when and where symptoms occurred. Things like that. When we're all all this data is able to be collected, aggregated, and then fed back, will just provide huge strides for us and also affect our own personal behavior. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much, and we can do this again in 50 years.